Most of us think of Freud as like a cartoon figure. He's on t-shirt and posters and as the butt of kinds of jokes and so on. I think many of us are ambivalent as to precisely his role in contemporary thought. On one hand, it's very common to, for instance, see a friend who is sharpening all their pencils and making sure they are writing utensils are in good order and say, oh, they're being very anal. For example, or somebody might say your behavior is very neurotic. It's common sense to describe aspects of human behaviors, terms that Freud and many of his colleagues popularized in the first part of 20th century. On the other hand, as I have said, many people think of Freud as someone poised between science and literature, and it's by no means the case that psychoanalysis as a movement has anything like the prestige that he did 50, 75 years ago. So I think many of us are ambivalent as between on one hand we want to try to explain our own and our behavior in psychoanalytic terms or at least using some of the principles of psychoanalysis, but on our hand we're not sure that there is in as master according to contemporary standards. In a sense, you want to have our cake and eat it too when it comes to using psychoanalytic ideas. The question is that a legitimate attitude to have, and if not, why is it not? But back to the principle of inference to the best explanation just to make sure we're clear. In principle, it is perfectly adequate way of trying to justify hypotheses as to how things work. So, for example, about a century ago, in the early part of the 30th century, scientists came forward with the idea of plate tectonics as an explanation for a number of phenomena that are arise partly in such earthquakes, the creation of mountain ranges for about a half century after that, evident about the spreading of the seafloor came provide pretty powerful justification for that theory. So while generally speaking all can't absorb the movement of plants that make up the crust of the earth, nevertheless one can get indirect evidence such as seafloor spreading, growing mountains, eruption of volcanoes and many other things that can be accounted for according to the theory of plate tectonics, and it was right that provide powerful support for that theory. That a theory was widely accepted by scientists today. Can something like that happen for Freud's approach? That's a question that we'll be asking. Now, as Freud begins to present his theory of a primarily unconscious mind, he tells us that there are two crucial hypotheses in psychoanalysis that are described as an insult to the entire world. One of them is, first of all, the claim that the unconscious process. The second one in the idea that was particular unconscious process are primarily engaged with employees of sexual and violent character that he think are the bulk of that's happening in our unconscious mind, and according to him explain a lot of human behavior. Whereas today's second nature almost is for that there are unconscious processes that account for human behavior a century or so ago that would indeed have been shocking. If we think of the incredible influence that Descartes and many of his followers had of primarily Western intellectual inquiry, it should come as no surprise that the idea of a mental state is almost something that brings with by definition the idea that it would be conscious. Remember phosphorescence. If you are a state of believing or wanting or expecting or wondering or experiencing something, then you can't help but notice that at least if you pay state of attention to your own mind. That's why Descartes was able to, in the process of developing his own rigorous theory of physical world, start out with introspection, that is, start out with the idea that he could survive that going on inside of his mind and be sure that he caught everything that he was looking for. Whereas if Freud's right, some processes are not open to introspection. Our processes are very difficult to find by means of introspection. What is perhaps more shocking, especially for the late Victorian audience that he was speaking to, is that both processes are very much about sexuality and violence. The idea being that without necessarily being aware of it, many of us have these powerful edges toward repression, sexual activity towards unfettered violence, but left to their own devices would probably express themselves in our behavior, but somehow for most of us we manage not to do so, and it will require soul explaining as to how that goes. So let me just go back to the notion of the unconscious to make sure that we're clear about that it is there a difference between something being non-unconscious and something being unconscious. Where all kinds of phenomena that happen inside me that are non-unconscious and not in any sense unconscious. The growth of my fingernails, my metabolism, the processing that happen to produce a visual image, for example, are all processes within me that are non-conscious, but that does not make them unconscious. What would be required to make a process inside of me unconscious is I would have to be a mental phenomenon. As we see before, mental phenomena divide to three primary types. Cognitive, things like beliefs, expectations, information processing, effective, and that's going to include case of emotions and moods, where emotions are mental states that come with feeling, but what also have an object. There will be things like fear and hope. There is always an answer or a question that you're afraid of or that you're hopeful about. And other types of affective states are going to be moods such as anxiety, exuberance that might or might not have an object. There may not be an answer to the question, what are you? And just about, for example, as well as experimental states such as experiencing the smell of vanilla or taste of a lemon. So those three primary types of mental state, cognitive, affective, experimental, are going to be the core constitutes of the mind. To claim that there is an unconscious phenomenon is therefore going to be to claim that there is phenomenon that's securing inside to me that is not conscious but is nevertheless cognitive, affective of experimental state. Now the question is the sorts of things could both be. What would they be like? How could we possibly be convinced that any of those things is actually occurring inside of us?